No Andrew yet. All right. Templeton World Charity Foundation is a philanthropy set up by the late Sir John Templeton. It aims to provide scientific breakthroughs and practical tools relating to the search for meaning, purpose, and truth. Through sharing these spiritual discoveries, the foundation aims to impact individual lives across the world. And at the moment, the foundation has over 200 projects in over 50 countries. The foundation has 6 core values that drives its grant making and really informs how it relates to the work that it does. First, it tries to seek a global perspective in all that it does. They seek out voices and ideas from around the world and see geographic and cultural diversity as a strength. TWCF embraces differences. The open-minded collaboration and a radical embrace of others who think differently is something that we really value. And where possible, TWCF strives to make spiritual progress possible. The spiritual dimension of human life, where truth, meaning, and purpose are central to human progress, is key to TWCF's work and mission. It aims to promote breakthrough discoveries, especially scientific discoveries that can redefine the frontier of human knowledge. And as an organization, it thinks like a startup. They cultivate bold and ambitious thinking with hopefully a minimum of bureaucracy, and risk-taking for greater rewards is encouraged. And lastly, the foundation strives to create impact for people. The goal is to help people live better lives and more purposeful lives using practical tools and being given relevant information about how to do that. So last year, TWCF launched a new 5-year strategy. And as part of this strategy, it has committed $60 million to support new scientific research on human flourishing and to translate these discoveries into practical tools. The foundation supports projects that will form a robust pipeline of innovations aimed at improving key aspects of human flourishing. The strategy is not just about making interesting discoveries, but also about translating these discoveries into practices that can be rigorously tested and launched for the benefit of individuals and communities. And there are 3 aspects to this 5-year strategy that are interrelated and will be working in tandem with each other. The first is discovery. The foundation will support interdisciplinary scientific research on fundamental aspects of the person and their well-being that can promote physical, mental, social, and spiritual well-being. The foundation will also be supporting work to develop, translate findings into practical innovations, such as new practices or interventions. And lastly, it'll be also launching some of these tools that and creating resources and platforms that spread awareness and uptake of the innovations across different sectors. So what is human flourishing? For TWCF, the concept is multidimensional and holistic. It connotes a sense of goodness and growth and is seen as opposite of languishing. Flourishing is both a momentary state and an aspirational goal. And flourishing is not just about individual wellness, but also the wellness of groups and communities. And in a practical and policy sense, flourishing is differentiated from just mere survival. So now I'm going to turn to Andrika Smith-Monroe, who is Program Associate for the Science of Spiritual, Religious and Spiritual Exercises program, who will be telling you about the nuts and bolts of what we are looking, who will be telling you about the nuts and bolts of the application process, I apologize, and some key dates. After that, I'll be sharing more about the funding competition and what the foundation is looking for. And last but not least, Sue will be sharing more about some insights and recommendations that she and her colleagues have developed as a result of the research sprint this summer about how to conduct scientific research that is meaningfully engaged with practitioner communities and is likely to have impact beyond the academy. Over to you, Andrika.
Thank you, Bonnie. As Bonnie mentioned, my name is Andrika Smith-Monroe. I'm a program associate at TWCF charged with assisting you through the RFP process. With that said, I would love to give you an overview of the process and highlight a few dates for you to mark on your calendars. We can break down the RFP process into 5 stages. We're currently in the first stage, expression of interest. And so from now to November 5th, we invite persons to register and submit EOI forms through the EOI portal. You can access the portal by visiting our Science of Spiritual Exercises webpage. And you can scroll to the bottom of the page to access the portal link. I will put the link in the chat for convenience a little later. A little tip when submitting your EOI form is to ensure you select marked complete at the end of the form, and then you'll be navigated back to the main page. Be sure to select submit, and that will officially submit your proposal. Once you have successfully submitted, you will receive an email confirmation. Feel free to submit more than one project. The EOI form captures basic information about your proposal. Such as intended team, duration, so the start and end date, and funding requests. The most important section of the form is the project or the program summary, which can be up to 1,200 words. When writing your summary, be sure to highlight the religious and spiritual exercise or exercises you're researching and explain why. You'd also want to describe your proposed research questions, hypotheses, methodologies, and causal impact on well-being outcomes. Also, how scientists, scholars, and expert practitioners will engage with each other and collaborate. And finally, explain how the project would stimulate thinking about innovative designs, and applications of spiritual and religious exercises as technologies for human flourishing. Once the portal closes, again, November 5th, our team will review the submissions, and by November 19th, persons will be invited to stage 2, which is the full proposal submission. The foundation will invite full proposals based on the merits of the proposed grants and to maintain a broad portfolio of different types of grants. The full proposal differs from the EOI forms because it requires more detailed descriptions of the relationship of the project to the initiative and the foundation's goals. Also, research and other activities to be done, an outline of the budget, outputs and deliverables, projects, anticipated outcomes, and the project's team members, and plans for interdisciplinary research practitioner engagement. We will invite 2 grant categories, project grants and program grants. Project grants are funding requests up to $234,000 USD. These types of grants are suitable for projects in their early stages, ready for piloting. And program grants are requests up to $500,000 USD. Program grants are more suitable for experimental trials or other rigorous methods to test for causal relationships between religious, spiritual exercises and flourishing related outcomes at the individual or the group level. The difference between these 2 grant categories are grant size and scope, and then the reporting requirements. Program grants require quarterly reports, while project grants require biannual reports. One fantastic element to the RFP process is our partnership with Sacred Design Lab, who is open and willing to assist prospective grantees with fleshing out their proposal ideas by scheduling office hours. We encourage persons who are invited to submit full proposals to take advantage of the Sacred Design Lab's expertise. All full proposals are due to TWCF by February 9th, 2022. Once full proposals are received, we will begin stage 3, which is expert review, in March 2022. With this stage, it's where you will patiently wait for us to complete internal checks and garner expert review feedback. As the name suggests, a mixed panel of scientists, expert practitioners, and/or religious scholars, and individuals with experience and expertise in human-centered design of programs and products will review each proposal. And Bonnie will mention or talk a little bit later about TWC, what we're looking for and how that relates to the evaluation criteria. The purpose of the expert review is to determine the quality of the proposal along a few key dimensions. It's important to note that expert reviews only provide funding recommendations. It is not the final or the only say on which grants are funded. Stage 4 is the applicant's opportunity to respond to the internal and external feedback. Following the external reviews, the TWCF's selection committee will shortlist the cohort. The shortlisted applicants will be invited to refine their proposals based on the feedback given and also write a written response to the external feedback by April 27th, 2022. The strongest proposals will then be recommended to the trustees, which brings us to our final stage, stage 5, decisioning. The trustees will review the final proposals in June 2022, and to that end, we'll communicate by July 2022 the grant outcomes with an anticipation of a September 1st grant start date. We acknowledge our application process may be a bit lengthy, but to ensure we are most efficient with our internal and external reviews, banking compliance, and obviously allowing applicants time to thoughtfully craft their proposals, we want to make sure that we give that time. So a quick recap on the two most important immediate dates: November 5th, the EOI portal closes, and November 19th, persons will be invited to submit full proposals. If you have any questions on the application process, please hold them for the Q&A portion, add them to the chat, and we will definitely address them during that time. I'll pass it back to Bonnie, who will share TWC's proposal expectations. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrika. So in the next few minutes, I will talk a bit about the types of religious and spiritual exercises. I'm going to call it spiritual exercises for short because it's a bit of a mouthful. But I'll be talking a bit about the spiritual exercises that this RFP is particularly interested in, the questions that research projects should try to address, and also a few other desirable features of project ideas. So for hundreds and thousands of years, people in religious traditions have developed and refined various practices that help individuals reach towards God or towards the divine, cope with and live well in the midst of the concerns and pressures of life. And in this way, religions may be an important source of practical wisdom and expertise about what people can do in order to flourish. Of course, not all religious practices that persist do so because they're good for solving problems related to our flourishing. Some may have evolved to meet other problems or needs, and others might just be sort of poor solutions. That said, a good deal of what people understand today as spiritual exercises are often offered and taught by religious and spiritual traditions because they're believed to be functionally oriented towards human flourishing. We think of religious and spiritual exercises as sets of actions that are repeated with the explicit intention of improving one's spiritual well-being. And sometimes various traditions call these spiritual disciplines. Perhaps the most widely recognized example of this kind of practice is mindfulness meditation, which is one of, mindfulness is one of 8 noble, one of 8 noble paths to enlightenment in the Buddhist tradition. And scientific research over the past 4 decades on mindfulness-based stress reduction has shown that it improves numerous psychological and health symptoms. At the same time, the practice itself has become something of an industry. While scientists have been working hard to examine the efficacy of mindfulness-based interventions and their impact on various outcomes, mindfulness has become popularized and is now easily accessible to millions of people as a form of life improvement practice. Today, there's a dedicated scientific journal on mindfulness and a number of other meditative practices such as loving kindness meditation, are now easily accessible through phone apps and at schools, hospitals, community centers, prisons, consulting rooms, the workplace, and so on. So we see mindfulness as a good example of a religious and spiritual exercise that has now been rigorously evaluated and made widely accessible. TWCF is now interested in identifying other spiritual exercises from a range of religious and faith traditions, both Eastern and Western, that have not yet been rigorously evaluated by empirical research, that may also have benefits on individuals and their communities. We're not only interested in contemplative practices, though we recognize that many religious and spiritual exercises involve contemplation of some kind. We'd love to explore a broad repertoire of spiritual exercises that may have positive benefits on practitioners in their communities. For example, a lot of religious traditions have practices that are ascetic in nature, such as fasting, or the practice of sobriety. Many of them have forms of study and meditation on sacred texts or scripture. There are many different forms of prayer. There's the practice of giving up of one's resources and belongings, like tithing or volunteering. There are practices that are a self-examination, like confession, a worship and the practice of being in congregational community, the practice of living in simplicity, the practice of Sabbath and rest, hospitality, and others. Some practices aim to calm the senses while others activate affective states. Some sensitize the individual to the environment, while others are aimed at disconnecting oneself from the world so as to better connect with God or with ultimate reality. And scientific research on religious and spiritual exercises does not yet reflect the diversity of practices and their associated aims and expected outcomes. So this program aims to address these by examining spiritual exercises that have generally been neglected by research. What is it that makes these sort of practices spiritual? Well, in one sense, many of these exercises are normal behaviors like reading, thinking, talking, giving, eating, singing, moving. Yet as John Templeton, the founder of TWCF, recognized, there may be more going on than just normal behaviors. And this initiative recognizes the power of the mind in conferring religious and spiritual significance to these activities, which may contribute in part to their effectiveness. The question of how religious and spiritual meanings of these practices affect their effectiveness is an empirical one. And in accordance with the Foundation's recognition that spiritual well-being is an important part of flourishing, in this RFP, we would expect to see operational definitions of religious and spiritual exercises that are authentic to the actual practices themselves. If the practice is being studied in the context of a religious or a faith community, then the operational definition of it should reflect the religious and spiritual meanings that practitioners associate with the exercise. If the exercise is an extension or an innovation of a religious and spiritual practice for use by a community with perhaps different religious beliefs or worldviews, then the exercise should be unambiguously rooted in specific religious tradition and described as such. And any new meanings or spiritual significance that is ascribed to the practice should be clearly articulated. It is fairly easy to know what are religious exercises, but perhaps more difficult to define what might count as a spiritual exercise, particularly in light of the increase in number of individuals in the US and elsewhere who self-identify as spiritual but not religious. For the purposes of this RFP, a practice would count as a spiritual exercise if it is designed to be practiced with the intention of engaging with the sacred, or to borrow from the work of folks at Sacred Design Lab, who you'll hear from shortly, it connects with this person's sense of what is beyond. A spiritual exercise is one that is designed to engage the practitioner with something that is intangible and greater than the self, that is outside of the self. And we set this requirement because Sir John Templeton had a capacious and also inclusive view of where divinity may be found. And he affirmed the view that there's indeed something greater beyond the self that can be found. And because TWCF is not just interested in research for research's sake, we're particularly interested in better understanding the effectiveness and causal mechanisms of spiritual exercises that may be scalable with the development of new tools or programs to make them more widely accessible and practiced. So to summarize, we're looking for ideas that projects that will investigate the causal relationship between the practice of a spiritual exercise and flourishing outcomes in individuals and or in groups, asking the question through carefully controlled experimental or quasi-experimental, empirical, and methodologically naturalistic research of whether a religious and spiritual exercise is indeed associated with positive outcomes. We're looking for projects that will attempt to identify, test, and confirm active ingredients, the active ingredients of these exercises to understand how they work. And lastly, we want projects to generate knowledge that can be applied to develop and test science-informed innovations for human flourishing for a range of contexts that are rooted in religious and spiritual exercises, basically to help us understand what specific elements are most likely to drive observed impact, and to consider how these elements might be included and integrated when we try to design innovations for human flourishing. There are a few other desirable features for projects. First, projects should have meaningful collaboration between researchers and practitioners. This is really important as the ultimate aim of the initiative is to develop science-informed, evidence-based, and human-centered tools for flourishing that are rooted in or inspired by spiritual and religious exercises. So to ensure that the operational definitions are authentic, projects should involve at least one co-leader. Projects should involve at least one leader, teacher, or expert practitioner as a co-leader of the project who will be responsible for interrogating and perhaps signing off on how the practice will be operationalized for research. Ideally, this person would be willing to also, if the opportunity arises, to act as a kind of practitioner spokesperson for the project, if the project is funded. As human flourishing is a holistic and multidimensional concept, the project should be looking at indicators of well-being and flourishing in multiple domains. Ideally, the project would not rely wholly on self-report measures of outcome indicators. And we would particularly welcome projects that try to look at more than self-report, for example, looking at physiological, behavioral outcomes. All funded projects will be required to engage with other funded projects and meetings, and more information about these sorts of requirements will be provided to those who are invited to submit full proposals, as these plans are still emerging. And lastly, we recognize that humans are social creatures, and religious and spiritual exercises are not meant to all be practiced in isolation. Thus, we're also interested in projects that explore spiritual exercises that can be practiced in group or community settings, and to look at impact at a group or community level. What is out of scope for this? Projects that are out of scope are those that will operationalize religious and spiritual exercises merely as repeated actions without taking into account the meanings and values that practitioners associate with them, and projects that try to explain spiritual exercises as in sort of nothing but actions kind of terms. Those are kind of out of scope and not what we're looking for. The RFP will not be funding any neuroscience projects. Also out of scope are the study of more esoteric practices that are not easily scalable or unlikely to be adapted to in contemporary or different contexts. Spiritual exercises that already have well-established or rapidly growing research base are less desirable. Spiritual exercises for children are also out of scope. And projects that are focused on really designing tools or programs are out of scope, and because there's likely to be separate funding opportunities for this kind of work where the bulk of the work is really to design innovative practices or innovative programs. The focus of this particular initiative is to better understand what and how spiritual exercises impact on those who practice them. So projects will be reviewed with along criteria, along a few different dimensions. First, we'll be reviewing projects on the basis of whether it fits with the initiative aims, and obviously better fit, the better. The better fit, the more desirable it is. We will be evaluating projects on the basis of the strength of researcher practitioner engagement, because this is an important value for TWCF. We will be looking for conceptual and methodological rigor in the projects. We'll be looking to see if there will be potential for scientific impact, practitioner impact, as well as cultural impact. And lastly, we'll also be looking at the expertise and capacity of the project team. And as Andrika mentioned earlier, the expert review panel who will be reviewing the expressions of interest as well as full proposals when we get to that stage do not make the funding decisions. They're responsible for evaluating projects for scholarly, technical, and impact-related merits. And funding decisions are ultimately made by the trustees of TWCF. So ultimately, this RFP is part of TWCF's effort to achieve their goal of developing tools and innovations that promote flourishing and that recognize the importance of the spiritual dimension of life as critical to human flourishing, whether as experienced and expressed within or outside of religious institutions. These are also tools that have been subject to rigorous scientific research and testing so that we can be confident of their effectiveness and of their impact. And these are tools that are genuinely designed for people, where user perspectives are at the forefront of the design process, not an afterthought. And I should know that this is really the end, the sort of the end point that the funding programs and in religious and spiritual exercises are moving towards. Clearly, with the scientific research program, we're primarily, again, focusing on establishing evidence base, understanding how spiritual exercises work, and the design and implementation and sort of effectiveness testing. Some of it will be included in this RFP depending on the projects, but not necessarily. So, and we recognize that to achieve this kind of goal needs collaboration from multiple types of partners. And so we have engaged over the last 9 months with Sacred Design Lab to better understand how innovation happens in religious and spiritual communities. And so I'm pleased to introduce Sue Phillips, who with Casper Turkile and Angie Thurston are the co-founders of Sacred Design Lab. Sacred Design Lab is a soul-centered research and development lab that is devoted to understanding and designing for 21st century spiritual well-being. Their work revolves around translating ancient wisdom and practices to help their partners, both religious and secular organizations, to develop products, programs, and experiences that ground people's social and spiritual lives. Like TWCF, they are interested in probing the depths of ancient traditions for insights about how to live well. And we have really benefited from their experience of working with organizations, communities, and designers, and now throwing scientists into the mix to build what they call the spiritual infrastructures for the 21st century. Sue and her colleagues at Sacred Design Lab have been doing research this summer that has informed various aspects of this RFP, especially highlighting to us the importance of collaboration between scientists and practitioners. Looking ahead, Sue and her colleagues will be involved in reviewing expressions of interest and also possibly with reviewing full proposals. They will also be working with TWCF to identify opportunities to engage folks outside of the scientific community to expand this program so that we can encourage innovative thinking and design for religious and spiritual exercises. So as Andrika mentioned, Sacred Design Lab will be offering some office hours to applicants who are successful and invited to submit full proposals. And these office hours will take place in December and early January. And more details will again be available for those who are invited to submit full proposals. So with that, I'm going to turn over to Sue. Thank you for being here today and for sharing what you've learned from your Insights Sprint this summer.
Well, greetings, everyone. How nice to join you today. My name is Sue Phillips, and I couldn't be happier to be with this amazing group who I know you can't see each other, but we can see who you are, and it's just a delight to be together to really brainstorm now that we know so much of the scope and the details about how this RFP is going to work, to dive in for just a moment to the question of how to manifest collaboration in a way that really serves the work. So just a moment about Sacred Design Lab. Bonnie mentioned that Sacred Design Lab is a soul-centered research and development lab. And really what we are is obsessed with innovation and spiritual and religious communities and how it works. We've worked with hundreds of innovators in this landscape. But really we founded Sacred Design Lab in order to participate in all these bridging acts of translation between the religious world and the secular world. And we've partnered with clients everywhere from Pinterest and the Obama Foundation, United Methodist Church, to Google and the US Surgeon General's office, which, while I like to think is a sign of our own prowess as partners, it's really a sign of the zeitgeist, which of course you all are sensing too and contributing to with your empirical research. But really we ask how ancient technologies like Sabbath and text study and mikvahs and pilgrimage can be reimagined for this age in new contexts. And also how we might do the jobs of traditional religious communities in brand new ways, like fostering spiritual formation and ensuring multi-generational connection. So we're sort of on the application side of what you all are researching, which is why we're so delighted to collaborate with Templeton World Charity to figure out how to anticipate this bridge at the science design and implementation stage so we can maximize the fulsome partnership between the knowledge generation that you all are so brilliantly responsible for and their application in the real world. So the research question that's been at the heart of the work we have just wrapped up with Templeton World Charity is to understand how to inspire the kind of science that's going to inspire the kind of innovation that is the holy grail here. So we interviewed empirical researchers, some of you who are on this call, and also practitioners and innovators ranging from, small group leaders at Saddleback Church to US Army Rangers to Shabbat innovators, all of which, the intention of which was to capture that wisdom so we could advise TWCF about how to shape this RFP. And really it's all about connecting great world-class science with real-world uses, but also real-world potential for innovation. And these are sort of, you can almost recognize those three categories in the three stages of funding that Bonnie laid out for us a few minutes ago. So let me just share a little bit of what we learned very quickly. Most of this will be familiar to you, but I'm sharing it again to help us just emphasize these and stabilize these insights coming into your own writing of expressions of interest. First of all, every single person we spoke to across what is purportedly a wide range of empirical researchers to like esoteric practitioners were extremely articulate about the limitations of science to study religious and spiritual things, which is kind of a funny way to begin talking about an RFP that intends to do just that. But I think it's important just to mention that a lot of those limitations have to do with decontextualization. They have to do with understanding functional benefits, but not existential ones. They have to do with sort of atomization or reducing really complex cosmologies and ideas and lineages and wisdom teachers to just one aspect of what is otherwise like super complex practices. And then the propensity to individualize what are inherently community practices, not only because they're literally practiced in groups, but because of teachers and teachings and the sense of community practice over time. So all the folks we talked with were just brilliant at describing both the limitations of science, but also the amazing opportunity that science offers to help us understand better the things that we do every day as practitioners. And that's what I'm going to focus on in this next section. One of the biggest lessons we learned from this research is that the best science from a practitioner and innovator perspective focuses on the felt needs of the practitioners. Specifically, so we talk to leaders of practitioner communities. These aren't people who practice yoga on their mats in their living rooms. It's people who lead communities of people who either train or practice yoga. And what they repeatedly described is needing science that helps them to do the things they need to do every day as leaders. And let me just give you some examples. First of all, there's quite a lot of research about what drives people to religious and spiritual communities. And I encourage you to have a look at it because a lot of those things are the issues that our practitioner colleagues mentioned. So things like helping people to stay faithful in their marriages, helping people to establish a spiritual goal and then stick to it, helping people deal with just terrible grief and loss, or people who want to make change in their lives. These are the things that people show up in these communities asking for help with. And that's the kind of research that these practitioners wish they had at their disposal, would be to help them do that better. So for like Eliza Klein, who's the executive director of One Table, who does amazing Shabbat innovation, the science she wants to really understand is about habit formation. For Pastor Steve Bladen at Saddleback Church, it's all about how people know that they matter in the world. It's about mattering. And for Major Brian Hendrick at the US Army Rangers, he's the brigade chaplain for the Rangers unit in Special Ops, it's all about the spiritual elements of combat readiness. So issues like integrity and the stability of identity for his soldiers. So the science can be a wide range, but it's all has practical implications. And I want to say a word, I've thrown around this word practitioners, and I want to just quickly say what it is, because I think these are the kind of folks you want to look to as for partners, to become partners in the design, implementation, and interpretation of the science that you are so expert at. And I'm really talking about people who serve groups of people who do the practices. That's the best way to put it. So we're talking about, clergy of all kinds, chaplains of all kinds, spiritual directors, religious educators, monks and nuns, imams, you get the picture. So it's not like our cousin's friend who sits in meditation. We're looking at teachers, people who can really understand that practice in context, because it's that fulsome context that we really want to add depth to the empirical research. So these folks are going to understand how all those pieces fit together. And of course, you can't accommodate necessarily all those pieces in the science that you are enacting, but it will especially help with the interpretation stage. Because, seriously, nobody can tell you, why sermons fail to land better than pastors. You can do all the science you work, but everybody who offers sermons knows how they can not hit the mark. So let's talk a minute about collaboration and what that can look like, because you'll find this word appears a lot in the request for proposals, and we're asking you to reflect on this deeply in the expression of interest stage. Now, I want to just quickly say a caveat that these are just gestures. They're not prescriptive recommendations, right? I am not giving you instructions about exactly what needs to be included. These are the kinds of things you might want to consider as a part of your design. So having multidisciplinary research teams was one of the fundamental insights that we heard this summer. And that it was especially from the scientists, frankly, the empirical researchers, who felt that monodisciplinary research teams just inherently couldn't do justice to the range of disciplines that are necessary to understand spiritual and religious practices and context. So multidisciplinary research teams, not just with practitioners, but with actually other academic disciplines represented. To actively involve your practitioner partner or partners at all stages of the research as a gut check, to develop ideas, to brainstorm what this could look like, just as thought partners, not just as kind of correctives to potential errors. And also to help just choose topics that actually matter in the practitioner field. You all, of course, will have your areas of expertise, but our sense was that there are ways to hone those questions within the practitioner sensibility that might make them especially useful. Because ultimately what we're talking about doing is centering the kind of science that has real world applications. I want to say a really quick word about trust. I know this is something you think a lot about. You plan a lot for in your research, is how to, even outside of like IRB processes and all that, this is really about acknowledging the complexity of the historical relationship between, and I'm going to use this inartful dichotomy between science and religion, but it actually came up with a lot of the folks we talked to. On the one hand, you have suspicion about whether science can really be used to understand inherently theological claims, but you also have like all these sort of Western dualities that science and religion are even separate realms, which is just anathema to some faiths like Islam that doesn't see any distinction between these two. So this is these conversations, especially if you don't have long-term relationships with practitioners, need to be contended with if we're to collaborate at the level that's probably necessary to do really amazing empirical research. So a focus on trust, I think, is especially critical. So a few final words before we turn it back over to Bonnie and Andrika for questions. Obviously, the end goal of all of what we're doing over time is innovation. It's about scalable and high impact applications using your research. Now, based on what Sacred Design Lab has seen, not only as a part of our research with TWCF, but also all of our other work, we really think that innovation will have more to do with how spiritual and religious practices are distributed than what they actually are. So it's less about understanding the mechanics of reading sacred text than it is about how you deliver the experience of reading sacred text to tens of millions of people. It's unclear, this is up to your brilliance to decide if some of that can be woven into your research design, but I'm just gonna encourage you to consider studying again, this is just me brainstorming, not me instructing you as a part of the review team. It's just to consider studying the efficacy of mechanisms to deliver the practices, not just the practices themselves, right? Just consider the mechanisms that are not just the essence of the practice themselves. Bonnie can clarify this potentially in the Q&A if you'd like. We've known for years that science can make a secular case for the functional efficacy of religious and spiritual practices. That has been so vital, and I think has really fueled the explosion of things like meditation, secular meditation. But I think science can also define the strategic direction for widespread innovation. And that is why we are so excited about this moonshot TWCF is making. And we just couldn't be more excited about where this is going and just to see what you're going to come up with. Just delighted to be a part of this project. I'm going to turn this back to Bonnie and Andrika for some follow-up. Thanks, everybody.